Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the HIT Lab seminar series. I'm Stan Kachnowski, Director of Digital Health Program at Columbia Business School Executive Education and Chair of HIT Lab, a digital health efficacy testing lab in New York City. And today I am really excited to have four incredible panelists join me to talk about clinical trials in the post-pandemic era. And I want to thank you all the participants that are still filing in virtually to the webinar here. And special thanks to an incredible panel. We're going to lead off with introductions from each of them in a minute, and then go into a series of questions. Certainly from myself, I am very excited to ask them about their opinions on some exciting issues, including the role of technology in clinical trials, CROs, and how those are going to evolve over the next several months, and then be in a position to really thrive following this era, this resurgence of life science as a significant leader in the global economy, and as it's always been, but now really at the forefront with breaking news stories every morning about what's coming out from folks from, and then the scientists really from Merck and Novartis, et cetera. And then we're going to take a lot of questions. So for folks that are listening, that are online, please queue up questions. We've got Justin Bulova from HIT Lab producing this with us, and he's going to be queuing us up, going through questions and making sure that our panelists are going to be challenged and ask some good questions to make sure everyone walks away from this program learning at least 3 new things. As someone who's been teaching for the last 30 years in biomedical informatics and now this field called digital health, we always want to make sure that one of our learning objectives is that you are going to walk away with 3 new things. Let's start off with some introductions. Certainly, I'm really excited to have Joris van Dam. He's the head of digital therapeutics at Novartis, and as we all know, Novartis has been doing a lot of work on COVID research. They've also been investing massively into digital therapeutics over the last 10 years. That's not a new thing for Novartis. Certainly, they were one of the leaders in investing in electronic data capture in the 1990s, and certainly have kept up that leadership even today, not just in electronic data capture, but in the entire spectrum of digital healthcare, which includes bioinformatics. And we all know that the CEO of Novartis is one of the world leaders and one of the world visionaries in bioinformatics, and not just biomedical informatics and apps and voice skills and those sorts of things, but really the range. Joris, if you could lead us off with a few sentences about yourself and give us some more background and on yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Stan, and thanks for having me today. And as you can see, as a somewhat self-respecting tech nerd, when the pandemic hit, I figured out how to change backgrounds in Zoom, and that's why you see here behind me the Colorado River at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. But as activities picked up throughout the pandemic, I forgot how to undo that. So I apologize for the somewhat weird background, but hey, we'll work through it. So I'm a computer scientist by training. Spent the last 16 years or so in pharma R&D. Since end of 2010, have had the pleasure to work at Novartis in their R&D departments, and having done stuff there that we now call digital, and prior to that was called health IT, e-health, m-health, and as Stan said, since 2016 focusing more on digital therapeutics. And again, pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite, Stan.
Again, thank you. And we know you guys are all busy, and really appreciate your time today. Next on the panel, again, most people know who Bill is. If you're in digital health, you know that he runs the largest digital health investment fund in the world. And his funds over the last 15 years since joining Merck have had an extraordinary return. I think I've read something on 2.7 range or something like that. And if he's not on the board of your company or not involved in your company, you want to link in with him and get him on your board and get him involved. It's great, Bill, to have you on board. Maybe a few sentences about your background as well.
Sure. Thank you, Stan, and thank you to the other panelists. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Taranto, and as Stan said, I'm president of the Merck Global Health Innovation Fund, which is one of Merck's funds that are fully dedicated to digital health. As Stan said, we're probably one of the largest in the world, if not the largest. We typically deploy well over $100 million a year just in digital health. The funding in and of itself has been quite successful, as Stan said, over the years. We've evergreened it twice, so we think we're pretty good in the whole digital health space. My perspective today will certainly be from the investor's perspective of what's happening as the way we see it in the clinical trial space, and what are some of the opportunities. So again, thank you, Stan, for inviting me today.
No, thank you again, and we know how busy you are, even though you're not flying around the world as you normally do. About 6 days a week, or we know how busy you are, and just getting everything together and moving forward, and really trying to help out during this crisis. Next on the panel is Jeff Ventimiglia. Everyone knows him as a senior VP of sales at Medidata, and again, just a legacy of doing a lot of good stuff on electronic data capture over the last couple of decades. Jeff, if you could also give us a few lines on your background and your work.
Absolutely. So I'm the Senior Vice President of Product Operations within Medidata, working with our product management organization. I've been in clinical research technology for 15 years now, and had the opportunity to work on multiple platforms across the industry. So I'm really looking forward to discussing more with these gentlemen today, and how we can push the envelope here.
That's fantastic, and really glad to have you on board. And for folks that are unfamiliar with Medidata, I'm sure everyone's familiar with Medidata. They are the clinical trials software digital leader, if you will. And I think one of the things that we're really discussing here today is technology and how it can rise to the occasion during this crisis, and the effects it's having on clinical trials. And for those of you who don't know, Medidata was founded by Glenn DeVries, and he did this at Columbia University Medical Center in Upper Manhattan, Washington Heights, 168th Street and Broadway. And so we're real proud from the Columbia University community to just have the one of the leaders in digital health, period, but certainly in life sciences, and have its roots at Columbia University Medical Center. And again, we always want to send our thoughts and to all the folks on the front lines, not only at the medical center, but around the world. And finally on the panel, we have Javier Lopez-Molina, just to bring it back to Columbia, of course, a Columbia Business School alum, and an executive at IQVIA, one of the world's leading digital health CROs, one of the world's leading CROs, but also, obviously a massive amount of digital work happening at IQVIA. Javier, maybe give us a little bit of background on yourself as well.
Yeah, so actually before IQVIA, I grew up as a molecular biologist, spent a fair bit of time in oncology, actually worked at Merck in MRL up in Boston many years ago, a former life. More recently, I've spent a lot of time at IQVIA helping pharma companies incorporate real-world evidence into clinical trial planning. So that's been one of my main focuses, and now more recently, I'm Director of Strategy in our Strategy and Portfolio Planning Group at IQVIA.
That's fantastic, and really, really glad to have you on board here. I know that certainly CROs are going through a ton right now, and strategic planning has got to be, what do? You're just rewriting the books right now on strategic planning and trying to figure out how to respond to this crisis with so many trials right now going into rescue mode, and trying to figure out what to do and how to do it with the number of patients and subjects being restricted from going to sites. So really happy to have you here. And we'll lead with you, Javier. I think it would be great for you to just kick off the conversation and talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing, the impact of COVID-19 and coronavirus on trials in general, as an opening kind of commentary there.
Yeah, I guess I'd split it into 4 different buckets. So I think the majority of the response to COVID-19 has been around maintaining trial continuity. So making sure that patients who need these clinical trials and these treatments have access to them. So there's definitely an at-needs population that has to be maintained. At the same time, I think companies are balancing that with the risk profile. There are some trials where you may want to delay, or you may want to think differently about how you are running that trial. And so I think that's sort of the majority. And then when you think about the new trials that are happening, or the new trials that are being scheduled, I think we have this term in the company that we call making a trial COVID-proof. And that's making sure that if you did have an event like this where you needed to engage patients digitally or virtually, or you needed to keep that kind of engagement and recruit in that particular way, that you have that flexibility in your protocol. So I think that there's definitely a panoramic or many different sided way of responding to what's happening. And I think a lot of companies are sort of taking it on a case-by-case basis.
It's fantastic. And, certainly at HitLab, we're doing studies every day, and we're trying to utilize, a lot of those techniques, virtualizing studies. So using, thank goodness, we still have shipping companies shipping things to subjects' homes, and we can trade tech in, whether it's a device like a goggle, or whether it's even an iPad for some of the e-source stuff that we're doing. I was talking to one of our researchers yesterday, and we were really pondering what we would have done if this was 15 years ago, and we had not had as many tools as there are today for being able to conduct clinical trials and clinical research remotely and virtually. So it's an extraordinary event that we're in the midst of, but it's also been significantly mitigated with the amount of virtualization, including using tools like Zoom, like we are now, to have these conversations. And conversations lead to innovations. It's a saying we have.
We're in a different place, than we were 10 years ago. We've been able to even have this conversation without the technology, and we have to leverage it.
Yeah, and certainly Joris, you're familiar with this as the head of digital therapeutics at one of the world's largest manufacturers. I think you have a good understanding of, you've been involved in this. I remember meeting you and hearing you talk about some of the early efforts of electronic data capture at Novartis when they were just really adopting and diffusing EDC very early on. And when you look at what's happening with this crisis, and you look at the digital tools that are available for study managers and study leaders and R&D executives, what do you see as the real opportunities, not only here in the US, but internationally?
Yeah, excellent point, Stan, and echoing obviously Javier's comments as well. We're seeing the impact, right? I think, was it yesterday in a Wall Street Journal article, clinical research is on lockdown too. Possibly not that bad, but yeah, we're definitely seeing an impact, and obviously we'd seen that before in our trial operations in China, and then it sort of followed the pandemic, right? Same priorities. First of all, how do you continue safety for patients that are on trials, right? Should you continue to treat them, and if so, how you can do that? How can you do that without them having to necessarily visit the study site? So, as you said, Stan, tremendous shipping logistics, and not just for things that we ship every day, but also for shipping investigational drugs, right? Which is not something that we typically directly ship out to patients because they're not approved yet, and because you have drug accountability responsibilities, and so on and so forth. New studies, new activities, particularly on-site activities, are obviously delayed. And we're also trying to have a targeted approach based on the area, right? So again, initially it was more China and related areas that were more affected, and so now we're looking at per area and per site basis. What do we do in affected areas? What do we do in recovery areas? So to make the segue to recovery, Stan, I think we're seeing more and more. I like the concept of COVID-proof trials, and COVID-proof activities within trials, right? I think we're seeing accelerated adoption of that because of two reasons. One, it increases the resilience of the study operations, right? Resilience seems to be a key word for society as a whole, but definitely for clinical trials as well, right? How do you make them? We're going to have next waves. We can argue until we're blue in the face about when and how bad that wave is going to be, but can we increase resilience of our trial operations when that next wave hits? And can we also accelerate? Because one of the things that we're seeing is push come to shove as a company, as an industry. The timelines that we're now seeing to roll out COVID trials is unprecedented, setting new records every day, right? Not just because of people working burning the midnight oil, tremendous efforts, but also when we put our collective minds to it, we can. So I think going forward, we'll see accelerated adoption of these tools to increase resilience of our studies for a next wave or a next virus or a next social, global, political event, as well as hopefully accelerating the speed of bringing new medicine to market.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think, those sorts of accelerated events are what we're seeing now. I think, metadata being where it is in the center of clinical trials and digitizing, virtualizing. Jeff, what are you seeing with, and we do have a question, Javier, coming back to you in a little bit about being able to have flexibility in protocols, which I'm sure you have a lot of optics on being at IQVIA. But Jeff, first, tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing to bring technology into the home so that these studies can continue, so they can actually continue without abatement, without any disruption, and what metadata is doing along those lines.
Absolutely. I think we heard from everybody else that we're seeing a slowdown in new trial starts, a slowdown to even a halt within patient recruitment, but that doesn't mean that we don't see a ton of ongoing trials that need to continue, right? And when we look at that, we see two aspects of that, really. We have, our patients who we need to ensure can remain safe and remain on drug for the time being. And then we also have to worry about, our ongoing study staff, whether that's the site or, the monitors who are continually going in and checking on them. So from that standpoint, we're really trying to engage risk-based monitoring a little bit more quickly and a little bit more encompassing so that, companies like Javier's have the ability to look at the particular sites, identify where people really need to be, and make sure that we're keeping our employees and our staff as safe as possible and, out of hospitals where risk is definitely higher. At the same time, we're looking at patient safety, right? Whereas we prefer, as often as not, to have telemedicine, remote visits, different ways of checking in with the patient, right? So you'll see us, providing more virtual trials capabilities through ePro, through consenting, through all of the different capabilities that can come together and really help us focus on continuing to treat that patient, but at the same time, keeping them safe, keeping them at home, and making sure that we're, living in a social distancing world. So we are definitely seeing that lean on of technology to support these trials and continue to move them forward.
Yeah, and that's just enormous. And I think that it's interesting that we've been grappling with this. And, I think, Jeff, certainly the team at Medidata on the emerging tech evaluation front, Javier at IQVIA has been doing this, Merck's been doing this, Novartis, Joris, and have been working with folks like Jake Laporte and Jeremy Sohn, on the leading edge of emerging technologies to figure out what's working. And it's amazing how over the last 10 years, really, we've seen, with the iPhone kick in 2007, and then a number of components start to really build up in momentum with the electronic health record movement and diffusion rate explode with the Affordable Care Act and the incentives for hospitals and for physicians to use electronic health records financially. We just saw a huge investment pour into digital health technologies. And it really has come to a point now where, we're really benefiting from this. And we've never seen the diffusion of digital accelerate at a point like this in the history of information communications technology. Simply put, it took about 5 or 6 years to go from about 30% of hospitals using kind of the HIMSS level 7 EHR to about 100% of hospitals using that. And it took about, the same amount of time for about 10% of physicians to use a HIMSS level 7 EHR to about 80%. A lot of physicians that don't have a lot of volume still don't use EHRs. Or if they're not using if they're not being reimbursed by any kind of managed care company or government group. So your dermatologist on Park Avenue is probably not going to have an EHR. But the idea here is that we have an epic event as absolutely extraordinarily destructive as it is forcing us to virtualize, and not just in life sciences, but in hospitals and in physicians. A good chunk of what we're seeing at the lab is a real swell and an extraordinary, like a tidal wave of activity for remote patient monitoring, for certainly telemedicine, for triage, for algorithms, and the radiological sciences and radiologists are using new techniques to be able to do their work virtually and remotely that we've never seen before. And I think this is also, portending well for folks like Bill, who are coming in and can help support these startups and support these crisis-driven technologies in a financial way, which is the fundamental, the building block of anything that's going to help patient populations, physicians, researchers around the world. Bill, from your side, what are you seeing as some of these emerging technologies that actually are coming onto the front lines that you're seeing are investment worthy, if you will, and have a real value proposition for folks in life sciences, for folks like Jeff and Joris and certainly Javier.
The interesting thing as it even relates to this topic around the clinical trial space, the great news is we're seeing lots of new startups in the community that help with recruiting, retention, and logistics. The bad news is there's a lot of companies in recruiting, retention, and logistics. And the question just becomes is, do they really work? Do they help the system? I think the early results are, yes, they do. This technology is great. They do begin to help the system as whether it's pure clinical trials or what the hospital's doing. I think one of the bigger questions that we look at from an investor's perspective, though, is so if you get that answer that yes, the real question though is this going to be the future modality of how clinical trials are going to be operated? And I don't think so. I think it's going to be all case by case. I think technology will enhance the way we're doing clinical trials. I think it will offer alternatives to the way we're doing it, especially around at home clinical trial. But I think it's really early, at least from an investor's perspective, of how all these technologies are actually going to pan out over time. And like I said, there's just too many different one-off solutions. Certainly I think from an investor's perspective, there's going to be some consolidation within the space, whether it's companies coming together or whether it's the large CROs, the Medidatas of the world, even pharma trying to consolidate some of these assets to bring a more unique asset in-house to do what they're doing, if that's the case, just because there's just too many solutions. But I said the good news as an investor, I have a lot of options, and we're looking as the GHI fund to deploy capital, within this space. We have 2 assets today, or 3, I should say, in the e-clinical space, but we're still learning, right? And we're trying to understand the adoption. Other technologies that you mentioned, certainly telemedicine is probably going to be one technology that's going to be more than not part of the future of healthcare. Just because that's easily adoptable, and we're actually seeing that in practice today because of COVID. And I think that will enhance what we're doing within the clinical trial space. But I think, as I said, we really got to try to understand where all these different types of assets fit, and how do you actually consolidate them to have one sort of consolidated approach to how you're going to use these technologies going forward.
Yeah, and that's something you've done over the last 20 years too, I think. And you've given a number of lectures for me at Columbia over the last decade or so. And it's always fun to talk about and hear about your portfolio theory, how you really try to bring your tech into 3 general groups: patient, physician, and health plan, and supporting life science through those 3 groups. And that I think we're seeing that now with the consolidation, some of the consolidation early right now into that play onto those platforms. And I was talking to a sponsor last week who was saying they want to use emerging tech, but not as a point solution. And right. You've always taught that in the classes you've taught from me at Columbia, which is don't go with point solution, go with platform. And if you're going to find a point solution, find a way to integrate it into a platform you're already using. Right. And I think that's certainly a really good lesson learned from this panel and from today's webinar. Certainly, Javier, we had a question from the audience about how to actually flex your protocol in this kind of crisis. So someone was wondering how does someone do that? But then I also had a question for you around the use of real world data. And Bill just talked about it, Jeff talked about it, Joris talked about it, but given the fact that we're virtualizing so many of these studies in a 30-day time frame, which for such a regulated area is unheard of. But the FDA is really helping out with this so far, just in the last few months now. So number one, how do researchers flex their protocols in this era? And then number two, if you could also comment a little bit about real world data and how that is coming into play and during this crisis.
Yeah, sure. So with the first question, I have to let you guys know my answer is limited on what I can talk about. So with that said, I'll talk about some stuff that's more high level. Is, when you write a protocol, you want to make sure, and the way that some people are thinking about things being COVID-proof, we want to make sure that we keep patients engaged during situations where they can't necessarily be engaged in traditional ways. So, for example, can endpoints be collected off-site or at the patient home? If not, how do we ensure that a site is being selected that can mitigate risks to the patients if they do need to come in? So it's that kind of thinking that you need to incorporate into the way that you write your protocol, the way that you think about your endpoints. I mean, a lot of this is known for a long time, a lot of clinical studies have endpoints that, you have your list of core primary endpoints, and then your secondary endpoints, are pages and pages long. And do you really need all of those endpoints? And is it okay to drop some of those endpoints if you've got a situation like COVID-19 where you don't really need to be collecting all of them, for submission purposes or for market access purposes? So I think it's that kind of thinking to really pressure test your protocol that we're taught, that our team is thinking about. With the second aspect around real world data, that's we could talk until I'm blue in the face about this topic. The FDA, before COVID-19, was signaling more responsiveness to incorporating real world data into clinical trials in the form of synthetic arms, and there's a lot of progress to that. I think their main concern, even in COVID-19, their main concern will be around data quality. And so if you are going to use real world data, which I think they're open to, if you're going to use real world data to say, let's not bring in our control arm anymore, we can use historical data from for a control, or historical clinical trial for a control, the same kind of data quality expectations are going to be there with the FDA. It's not like they're throwing out that concept of data quality and just saying like, oh, it's okay to just use real world data. I mean, real world data comes in many shapes and forms, and some of it is quite dirty. And so, there's got to be checks and balances to using, to making sure that data is high quality. So I think that in COVID-19 era, there's, I think, a little bit more of a flex there. But I think post COVID-19, that data quality standard is going to still be an expectation.
That's fantastic. And Jeff, let's expound upon that a little bit from what you're seeing around being able to mitigate some of the effects of this crisis on clinical trials, and what you and your team are seeing on the front lines. How are people flexing for, patient recruitment, patient enrollment, patient site visits, that sort of thing. And, I think the other thing to talk about too, that we're all aware of, is the geographic differences. So studies that are taking place in one part of the country right now are largely unaffected, but if it's a study in New York City, it's shut down. And so it'd be good to get your viewpoint on some of the mitigation strategies you're seeing your customers and your teams at Medidata deploy to help mitigate these things. Jeff, you're on mute, I think.
Yep, sorry about that. Wanted to make sure you didn't have any background noise. But one of the things to Javier's point that you're always going to see is recruitment issues, and I think you're going to see that even doubly now. And I think in the past, you have seen that the most common reaction to that is just to open more sites, right, with the hopes that more patients walk through the front door. And I just don't think that that's going to be reasonable, for the short term. But I think we're also going to learn that that's not the case for the long term either. I think this is going to be with us for a while now. And so when we look at that, we have to look at the data in two different ways, right? So I think one, the synthetic control arms, right? As much as we can try to keep that patient population down and really focus on treating those in need, that's going to be really important. And so the data quality, the data standardization is really important there. But we also need to get better at enrollment, right? We need to be able to to what Bill was saying, I think we need better interoperability across all of our different point solutions and platforms so that we have a better way of using AI, machine learning, whatever it is, to identify patients in the real world population rather than waiting for them to walk in the door, because that is just increasing our risk again. So, we need to identify patients at a better pace and in a better way, and we need to keep the counts who walk in the front door down so that we're not exposing people to this risk all the time. And that's what we're really seeing is how do we keep patients safer by using data in different ways to identify them and work with them.
Yeah, that's absolutely critical. And I think, the term around that line of thought, Jeff, that's been used has been something called a digital biomarker. And again, this is a phrase that started getting kicked around after Eric Topol wrote his book in 2012, The Creative Destruction of Medicine, which really did define the field of digital health. And just loosely, as a field, it's bringing together bioinformatics, which is all the data from the human body, and biomedical informatics, which is all the data around the human body, whether it's an app, an Apple Watch, a voice skill, whatever it might be. So that combination effect now has created this term called digital biomarker. And that means that the real world data that's being collected from your Apple Watch is so objective. It's very much like a blood test or a skin test or a DNA test. So this term digital biomarker, Bill, we're seeing now a number of these come out. Now there's obviously a lot to be done still in terms of making them clinically valid, a la FDA word clinical being a validated digital biomarker. But at the same time, we are seeing an enormous amount of these coming out today, whether it's from the phone, the smartphone that you're carrying and the accelerometer, the camera that it carries and being able to take pictures of skin, throat, blood vessels in the eyes, ears, whatever, or whether it's from even the voice recognition. Now there's a number of emerging technologies using these high resolution microphones on the latest smartphones from Google, Apple, Samsung, Lenovo. And so the idea here is that we actually have a plethora of digital biomarkers. What are you seeing, and which technologies are you seeing really at the forefront of this effort from the life science side and from the digital biomarker side?
Are you asking me, Stan?
Yeah, Bill, sorry. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. You know what, that's the most exciting area for us as an investor that we're looking at. What we're seeing right now is much more on obviously the medical device side, and we're seeing in areas of cardiology and neurology seem to be, at least what we're seeing, the more advanced companies. Especially around areas like spatial movement. We're seeing a lot of trials using digital biomarkers within that space, a lot in cardiology as well, because the cardiology monitoring is so advanced today. So that's kind of a big area we're looking at from an investment perspective is how you begin to collect that, and then how you do analytics against it. What's the appropriate analytics against those type of digital biomarkers? But more importantly, what are the right digital biomarkers, that should be collected? That's just because you have a company collecting them doesn't mean it's the right company for us to invest in, because I don't know if that, we have to figure out whether there's a clinical validation that's meaningful to the healthcare environment to collect those types of digital biomarkers. But I would say from us as an investor, that's probably one of the more exciting areas that we're looking at, is how do companies participate within the clinical trial to collect those digital biomarkers, but also put analytics against it and informatics that tell us something more meaningful than maybe potentially what you might get off of reading off an Apple Watch that might not be clinically relevant. So, what is the clinical relevance of these digital biomarkers? But, like I said, we're looking for those companies that are more on the analytics and informatics side of it, that can only collect it, but do that analytics and informatics component to it.
Yeah, that's enormous. And I think one of the things that we're seeing along those lines, and this question really comes from the audience, someone's asking about how the pandemic is accelerating the development of these technologies, and also from a HitLab standpoint, you all know HitLab's about diffusion. We're focused, and we're really the only research lab out there that's focused on a diffusion base of technology adoption and trying to see where it's going to end before we start. And I think, Joris, you could maybe talk to us a little bit about this, but we're seeing a lot of expedited use authorizations come out from the FDA, not just on molecules and not just on therapeutics, biologics, et cetera, but a lot around digital. And you guys all saw it, Bill. Certainly, about Livongo. They within I think 2 or 3 weeks of the crisis hitting, Livongo received, just an expedited use authorization from the FDA for an intervention as well. Joris, from your side, how is the pandemic affecting the not just the development and the design, but also the diffusion of these digital therapeutics?
Yeah, fundamentally, Stan, we talked a little bit about the direct impact of the pandemic, right? But there's also this broader discussion: are we going to go back to normal, or what is the new normal that we're going back to? And we already talked in this panel about geographic differences, etc. There's also, I think, indication therapeutic area differences, or more concretely, fundamentally, the patient-provider relationship in some indications is going to be transformed, is going to be rethought. For example, immunocompromised patients, is the clinic, with everything that's walking around at the clinic, COVID and other viruses, is the clinic still the right place to treat immunocompromised patients, or is it better to do that either smaller infusion centers or at-home treatments, etc.? There's also going to be a reduced capacity at the clinic, right? So will you have enough staff at the clinic to sit a patient down, put the blood cuff on the patient to measure the blood pressure, right? Or do you send a device home and take the data quality impact, fix it on the back end, right? So we're going to have therapeutic area impact, we're going to have capacity impact, but also I think the pandemic is transforming the relationship that we as pharma have with payers. What evidence do they want to see from our medication? And there I think is a tremendous opportunity for further diffusion of digital endpoints and biomarkers. We can think of them as primary biomarkers to demonstrate that our drug is working, but more and more we're seeing that particularly payers, but also regulators now want to see a broader impact on the quality of life, right? To give a very specific example, we've been very active with digital tools in multiple sclerosis, where clinical practice is very much focused on function and mobility, right? Measured by clinic assessment called EDSS. But when we went out to patients a couple of years ago and we asked them what keeps you up at night, literally, function and mobility was number 5, and number 1 through 4, I forget in which order, was pain, anxiety, depression, cognitive functioning, and fatigue. And none of the drugs treat that or focus on treating that because we're not measuring. We're measuring EDSS, right? And we go to the regulators with our claim on EDSS. So the ability for us to measure cost effectively and reliably to collect real-world evidence about how is that affecting patients, how is that affecting disease progression, because there is particularly in inflammatory diseases, a link between how depressed you are and your flare-ups. There's a link between how is your mental health in general and the overall cost of care, healthcare resource utilization. So I also see particular diffusion in, let's say, secondary endpoints that measure this impact on the quality of life, on healthcare resource utilization, etc., because we can now measure them effectively with those tools, voice, real-world evidence from claims databases, and so on and so forth, and also because all the examples I just gave are absolutely non-unique to multiple sclerosis. Maybe the order is a little bit different, right? But everyone in chronic diseases is struggling with pain, with anxiety, with cognitive functioning, with fatigue, and so on and so forth. So the adoption or diffusion in your terminology of digital endpoints, particularly in mental health, in nutrition, in mobility and function, I think we're going to see that accelerated now with our more limited ability to assess patients on site.
Yeah, I think that's really the take home here, right? Is that so much of this is virtualizing so quickly. And, that's really part of when we had met yesterday and talked a little bit about some of the topics for today's panel, we talked about the virtualization of clinical trials, and really at the forefront of that is the CRO. And, Javier, from your standpoint, there's a lot of technologies floating around. You've got a lot of apps helping folks with their online patient data entry. You have a number of smart pill solutions helping people with their medication adherence, whether it's with a blister pack or a pill bottle. You have a whole slew of home monitoring solutions like Joris has talked about that are creating these sorts of technologies as well. From your standpoint, the future of the CRO, what are some of the leading digital solutions that you think will, and this also aligns with the question we just picked up from Rachna as well, that are going to change the model of the clinical trial in the future? Will they be more home-based because of this? So will the new normal in 2021, 2022 be that we're just going to plan
yeah. So I mean, I have a perspective on that, which is we operate in a very conservative and regulated environment, and for good reason. There is an obligation when you run a clinical trial to make sure that the drug is safe and that you report any of those effects from the drug. And so I think that any kind of virtualization has to incorporate that. You can't, there's just no way around that. And so because that's the case, I just don't see a world where the site goes away. I just don't see it. The site might take a different form and have different responsibilities, but the site has at its core, it's got your approval board. It's got people who review the effects of the drug and things that are happening that that's difficult to do. That's difficult to just get rid of. So I think any solution that is going to have staying power needs to incorporate and make sure that, like, these foundations of clinical trial and the foundations of the things that the FDA and regulators are looking for, those are still in place, because frankly, the FDA is not going to change. I think the pillars of what they stand for are going to be there after COVID-19. So safety and efficacy.
Yeah, really, we are lucky in a lot of ways. Over the last 5 or 6 years now, the FDA has set up a digital health group to help oversee the virtualization of clinical trials. And so in a lot of ways, it's a good thing that we have this structure now so that we can actually have a systematic and an organized way of processing this tech. Jeff, from your perspective, how do we make this faster? Metadata is at the center of all this happening. What do we do to accelerate this within this current crisis mode we're all in?
Yeah, and I agree 100% with Javier. I do not think the site is going away. But I think what we're learning here is that we need to have a lot of contingencies in place so that we can maintain these studies when something like this happens, right? And so we are conservative. The FDA is a regulatory agency, but I think we do need to take advantage of what we've all learned here, right? That we can do webinars over Zoom, so we can do telemedicine visits. We can use data to identify patients. And we can certainly start to think about, digital endpoints being not tertiary or secondary, but how do we really start to use some of the biomarkers, the different pieces of omics pulled into more primary endpoints so that we are able to capture data in a different way. And again, keep patients safe, keep the visits down, not down to zero, again, Javier, but down to where we're making sure that they're only coming in for essential visits and we're able to do different parts of the clinical trial at home. And what makes that happen is for sponsors, regulatory agencies, technology groups, CROs to all come together and say, you know what, this time we are going to make a change. We are going to start implementing some of these things and using them on trials, and we're going to get going, I think.
That's fantastic. And Bill, a lot of sites were resistant to digitizing, to virtualizing. The ones that did are in a really good position right now to be able to, really do what Jeff just said, which is be able to pivot and have that kind of what Javier talked about, the COVID proof or pandemic proof kind of setup. Do we have the digital technologies today? And this is really coming from Sarah. She wants to know that how are companies, specifically, I guess you could talk to Merck, but even just generally, able to work with the sites to help them virtualize faster and virtualize on a dime today?
Yeah, I mean, the big issue, the technology exists, but technology is an enabler in the end, and it's going to do things to help things like retention. It's going to help things like recruiting. It's going to help things in logistics. I think one of the bigger questions that why some groups are slower to move is does digital tools really reduce costs in the in the clinical trial market? And I think what we're seeing, at least at the beginning, it's not so much a cost reduction, it's a cost shifting, and it's cost shifting more towards what I would say routine tasks and logistics where you see help. I think longer term, where you'll see new business models and profits coming is from data collection and the use of that data more longer term. But I think there's just why the uptake is a little slower is just what's the right use of these technologies? How do you implement them correctly? And as I said earlier, there's just so many solutions where you don't have an integrated solution for any single provider. And that causes increased costs because you have to go to so many different groups to try to do what you want to do using these types of technologies. So again, I still believe that ecosystem approach is going to happen where somebody starts to think about how do you consolidate some of these assets. I think then over time, that's where you'll see, quicker adoption. I agree with everybody, the sites aren't going anywhere. I was mentioning earlier that the modalities there, but I don't think that's going to be the future modality of only use of technology. And I think we just have to understand that the technology exists and more technology is coming, but you have to think in terms of it as an enabler and how does it enable it in the right way. And then the way that I look at it is if we can enable it in the right way and it's the right use of that technology, that's the right kind of investment that I would look at. But it does exist, but it has to be used appropriately.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into a question we just picked up from Farron, and really trying to understand, using that right technology. And there's a term at HitLab we talk about in terms of symmetrical information and symmetrical adoption and diffusion of technology, so that all populations are able to benefit from this. Joris, you work globally. I know you've done some great work in Africa. A lot of work in Europe and Asia. And from your perspective, there are a lot of populations out there that may not benefit from this digitization, and this is truly a revolution. Usually, people use the word revolution loosely, like a 40-year industrial revolution. This digitization of life sciences is happening in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. Revolutions usually occur within a year. This is a true revolution for the first time in technology history. We're seeing the rapid escalation and diffusion of technology go from 5 or 10% to 50 to 70%. And Joris, from your side of things, when you look at all the populations that are out there, and what Farron's really trying to understand is, what's your perspective, what's your opinion on how these technologies are going to be accessible to all populations, not just the wealthier or the folks that are in North America or the EU or some of the wealthier Asian nations?
Yeah, so as you know, Stan, my long-standing dream, which we may see come true in times of pandemic, is the other way around, right? There's no better place to innovate than in developing world and emerging countries, because there's a tremendously high unmet need. There's also less legacy in terms of electronic health record systems from the 1980s, in terms of, everybody in IT and related areas knows, I think it was Grace Hopper who said that the worst sentence in the English language is because we've always done it that way, right? It does not apply to emerging world because we haven't always done it that way, right? And so my hope is that we'll see a lot of innovation, as Bill Gates calls it, innovation for the poorest of the poor, driving innovation globally. There is a tendency to first innovate in the more developed countries and to then see what we can export. I'm still hopeful we can see things the other way around. And we are seeing some of that now, perhaps not yet in clinical research, but definitely in the pandemic response, right? I was speaking with colleagues in India, how do you implement stay at home for 6 billion, right? We already struggle here with our 75,000 in beautiful Quincy, Massachusetts. So how do you do that for the whole Indian country, right? And they use technologies much more than we do. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity. This pandemic was a pandemic that first ravaged Western countries and then is also going to developing world regions. many have been going the other way around, right? Ebola, Zika, HIV, you could argue. But the whole point, as you know much better than I do, Stan, about global health, is that you cannot say we're the developed world, we're healthy, and we're not going to care about the rest. It doesn't work that way, right? So you have to continue to work, and I think we have a tremendous opportunity to innovate, to find solutions that work in emerging regions, in developing countries, and then translate them to our world rather than the other way around.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think you're spot on. I mean, this kind of point in time where we have innovation as the the cornerstone of these new thought processes and these new business processes, technology processes is really cornerstone to this. Javier, we've got another question. Again, we've got a lot of questions coming in, well north of 100 folks on the webinar today, but they want to know what you think about how recruitment and retention, two major issues in clinical studies, can be improved and can be enhanced with folks because of this remote situation that we're in now, doing a lot of these studies remotely. What are your some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is where I think it dovetails into this conversation around telemedicine. I think telemedicine back before COVID was 1%, less than 1% of physician-patient interactions, and now in the new normal that we have in this pandemic, it's become 50% of the interactions. And it's interesting because think about that number, but think about the converse of that, which means 50% of people are still physically seeing their physician. That to me, like I'm in New York City, that's shocking. That I would think that number would be like 20% or 10%, but it all depends on specialty. So it all depends on how severe is your condition, how severe are you presenting, do you need to go in for a lab? So a lot of these different things I think are ways that we need to think about using telemedicine in this new future. Actually, there's a great case study of I forget what the company's called, but it just launched migraine product. And just think about launching a drug in this environment is a huge task. And they're doing it almost entirely digitally. And they've got a link on their website that connects you to a telemedicine visit that then you can get diagnosed for the condition, have the drug shipped right to you. So the whole chain is being managed. And it's a great example of how companies are adapting to use technology to for this end. And I think you just need to take the same and apply it to patient engagement when you're thinking about recruitment.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And Jeff, we've got a question from you. And again, we've got about looks like about 7 minutes left. So folks in the audience, please do continue coming in with the questions. We love it. And Javier, if you could send me that case study, what I'll do is I'll post it on my LinkedIn account.
I'm looking it up now.
Okay, great. So anyone in the audience who would like that, we'll send it out to you via LinkedIn. Or if you want to link in with me, we'll post it on my LinkedIn account and get it out to you that way. But Jeff, the idea around medication adherence and really trying to reduce trial size by having tech in the study that really helps the researcher and the investigator understand, has the medication even been touched? We know that there's certainly a lot around that, and with adherence technologies that are out there today, being able to do smaller trial size, and then even from a public health standpoint, for all the different treatments around the coronavirus, making sure that patients are going to dose fully. The last thing you want to do is create a superbug, because patients are only dosing 50% to 3/4 of the regimen, and then they're dialing it down or completely dropping off, and then we've got a superbug created because patients didn't dose properly. What are some of your perspectives on how those sorts of technologies can be rolled out better, integrated better? Again, you guys are that kind of the core silo of electronic data capture. Yeah. So the challenges. I mean, the integration is brutal. So is this something that is realistic in the near term, so that companies developing these technologies and these biotherapeutics can actually implement this kind of adherence model?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know what Bill was saying was absolutely right. Right, we know that the digital technology is out there. We see a lot of companies creating these things. Trial supply is the forefront of our mind when we think about even coming close to virtual trials, right? Because we need to find a patient, enroll a patient, randomize them, get their drug, and make sure they took their drug, all within maybe the first week of the study there. So being able to create technology around that is extremely important to us, so that we can actually, you know, take that flow with that patient, be able to bring them into the study, put them in an arm, give them medicine, and be able to track that. And I think what, you know, we often talk a lot at Medidata about how do we make data come to life, right? We can continue to collect and collect and collect data, but we have to start figuring out how we can share the data and use the data. And so I think on top of all of this, you're going to start seeing things like NLP and AI, and then this concept of semantics come in, so that all of these different applications, all of these different components are talking to each other and being able to monitor, right? Because you don't want to just have an e-consent that passes it off to RTSM, that passes it off to an ePro that passes it off to, you know, a monitor. You want to be able to actually follow that flow with them and have that interoperability to be able to track that patient. And I think that's where we really need to focus. I know plumbing isn't always the funnest part of technology, but really focusing on the, you know, the sharing and activating of that data is extremely important to us.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, you know, again, no one's been leading that more than what you guys are doing. Bill, we've got about 3 minutes left here, so bring us home. You know, really, we're gonna hit you with a double barrel one here. We've got a question from Jim that came in a couple of minutes ago, who would like to know what you think is the single biggest opportunity where digital can improve the performance of remote clinical trials today. And, you know, you don't have to mention company names, but certainly, you know, the general area and in the next 24 months. So kind of COVID and then post-COVID, which is really the entire topic of this this conversation today. So what are some of your perspectives there? And then we'll look for one or two key learning points from each of you after Bill finishes up, and we'll wrap it up from there. Bill?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think as it relates to the clinical trial market, and again, as I look from the investor lens, try not to solve everything and start small. And the things that seem to be most impactful today are, and where the technologies are most rapid, are in recruitment, retention, and what we call logistics, you know, easy routine things that are the owners, so that logistics bucket. I think ultimately that's early on where we'll probably put more of our dollars at the beginning. And I think because you can show more quickly than not that these early types of solutions actually help you know, the market, generally speaking. And so I think it's also tied into that. What was just said by Jeff is, what are some of the other ancillary technologies that you have to integrate? Because it's not just about the clinical trial sort of application. It's all about the other applications that sit under it or beside it. You know, it's artificial intelligence, it's quantum computing, it's blockchain, you know, how you're managing supply. It's all these other pieces that also have to come together as part of that integrated solution. So, you know, I think going back to thinking more of an ecosystem and a platform approach than a point solution is really the way to go. And again, it's more about simplicity. What are the easy tasks today? What are the jobs to be done? And what are the easier jobs to be done with use of technology? And I think that's what we'll continue to look at. I think your second question, you know, I think post-COVID, and when that even occurs, and it may be a long haul, you know, technology will always have a role in the way healthcare is going to be practiced. And again, it's just an enabler. And what we just have to think about is, how do we make everything easier for the patient, everything easier for the physician, and everything easier for the community. And those type of things I find always get adopted a little quicker than not. So we'll continue sort of this post-COVID sort of time frame as to looking at what type of technology, like telemedicine, which is an easy thing to implement. And I think, as Javier said, it's growing. So it's an area we're going to look at.
That's great. And we are out of time. It is on the top of the hour. thank you, all four of you, Jeff, Bill, Javier, Joris, for your time today. Thank you to a terrific audience for over, again, north of 100 folks joining us on this busy Wednesday morning. And special thanks to Medidata, certainly Patrick Mullen, Jeff Ventimiglia, Tarek and Glenn, the whole leadership team there for not just sponsoring this, but obviously for doing the great work you're doing during this crisis to keep these trials moving any way we can. That's it from myself and the team at HitLab and Columbia Business School. Have a great day, have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week on the next webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.